Hello everyone and welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the teas and coffees. If I could just check, if you have a yellow dot on your pass, this is your last chance to sneak out without anybody noticing for the breakout session that you might be in on Be More Green. But for the rest of you in the audience, we're back up and running. And as we mentioned just before the break, we're going to get stuck into now the relationship between levelling up and lower emissions. So that is the purpose of this session. We heard from Helen and from others that there's a happy coincidence here that actually many of the opportunities, many of the jobs and the growth that's going to come are actually dotted right around the UK from the pursuit of net zero. And we know that whilst many of the targets and the ambitions and the aspirations are set nationally, indeed globally, the things that will make a difference and make it happen are very much going to take place locally. And to get stuck into this topic, we're going to be steered through it by Ray Newton-Smith, the CBI's chief economist. And it's brilliant that we've got on the panel here Polly Billington from UK 100, Guy Newey from the Energy Systems Catapult, Faye Bowser from Siemens PLC, and David Croft from Reckitt Benckiser. So on that note, Rain, over to you.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and it's great to be back here this morning. And I love doing a session after everyone's been refreshed by coffee and tea and hopefully some great conversation. So it's nice to see so many friendly faces. Look, I think one of the big contradictions about climate change is that its impact is completely global, but actually fixing it and changing it really actually happens at a very local level. It's absolutely about how we heat our homes, about how we travel to work, what we eat, where it comes from, where we buy it, and how the businesses in our local communities are run and which businesses are there. And I think what we do know is that a successful transition will absolutely create better jobs in our local communities in new and growing sectors, and it should create centres of global excellence and global clusters like we've seen at Zero Carbon Humber, and I know some of my panel will touch on this. And it should quite literally improve the air that we breathe in our local communities, and I think that's something that we at the CBI have done some work on. Our team at CBI Economics have shown how improving air in our local communities to WHO targets can really add 1.6 billion to our economy every year and save millions of working days. So it really shows how the sort of co-benefits of the move to low carbon economy can really help us live longer and healthier lives. But actually doing that in practice in the local level is not easy. It takes a lot of hard work and a lot of actors working together, local authorities and local government and businesses, and all of this happening together. And so I think what we wanted to do is have a bit more of discussion about what this really means. How does this really play into the levelling up agenda? How can we really show that there are opportunities for all regions? We've also recently done some work with Data City, looking at local authorities and just looking at the net zero businesses that are already there, the businesses that are really leading the energy transition, whether that's in renewable energy or whether that's also in sustainability services and the contribution they're making to the economy. And it's clear those businesses are already contributing about 60 billion to our economy every year, and with higher, on average, wages. And of course, that is improving our standard of living. But we know there are challenges around the transition, and it won't be easy for all communities, and we need to do this right, and we need to see some of that action. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by 4 experts who can help shed some light on how we actually make this happen in practice. So look, Polly Billington, CEO of UK 100, I thought I might start with you. I mean, your job really is to work with these local leaders on a day-to-day basis. What's the sort of biggest challenge they face, and why is this local context so important, and how can we really help those local leaders?
Well, the thing that's missing at the moment is that national government has now acknowledged that local is important. You can see that in the net zero strategy, but there isn't a plan to act on that strategy. And I think that's fundamentally because although they are acknowledging that local is important, they haven't really got clear in their heads And I think a lot of people haven't got quite clear in their heads what the role is of local government in being able to do this. And that needs to be fully clarified. So I think that requires a proper plan, milestones, Gantt charts, all that stuff that you guys as business are really are good at. And as Guy will say, as a former civil servant, so are good civil servants. And that means that we can see where things go. Because targets are great, but you need to be able to direct and work out how you get to achieve those targets. So that needs a proper plan. We therefore need a cross-departmental unit, which is the one single door which local government can go to access and understand what national government is going to do. Why is this so important? Because local government has a lot of powers, but they are currently being constrained by national frameworks. So there are three things that basically constrain local government as well as the rules, which is capability, capacity, and resources. But if you look at the rules, Ofgem, quite often, the regulatory framework for energy constrains what local government can do. The Highways England will constrain what local government can do when it comes to roads. And so it can go on, national planning policy framework and so forth. So what we need to do is understand where those national rules and regulations are limiting local government powers, understand the existing powers. We've done a comprehensive analysis of the powers that local authorities have that can be used for net zero. And then crucially in this context, I would say businesses have a really important role to play, because if you ask your local authorities what they want, what they're going to do, and offer to work with them, if you understand the powers that they have got that could help you achieve your net zero targets, you can be working much more closely in step. I've had really interesting conversations with businesses where they've been saying they've been really struggling with, behaviour change for their employees because they're still coming in by car. And they've literally not spoken to the Transport Authority about whether there should be some improvements in the public transport system. They haven't spoken to them about whether there needs to be some separated cycle lanes in order for people to feel safer. They haven't spoken to them about whether, even if you can't improve the regularity of the buses, you can at least make sure that everybody can see when the buses are coming. They haven't talked to them about whether there's those kind of things outside of the gates of their of their operations. Local authorities can make it easier for them to be able to do things. So I would say a plan, a unit, proper resourcing, and can I particularly end on one thing which I'm really enthusiastic about in relation to what the government has done, and that's the UK Infrastructure Bank. Yeah. They've got an advisory facility for local authorities to help them with due diligence to be able to get their projects ready for investment. However, local authorities are not getting development capital from the investment bank. It'll be investment capital too far along the pipeline, frankly. And this is a good example of why local government is so important, because frankly, local government will do it anyway. The City's Climate Investment Commission is establishing a development finance facility precisely because if they waited for national government, they'd be waiting a very long time.
Look, I think that's great, Polly. I think there's just so much that businesses can do, like working with the local authority. As you say, it's about bus services, making sure people can get to work, thinking about recycling. There's just so many touch points, particularly when you're thinking about reducing your carbon emissions. But who, to your mind, which local authority, is there anyone that you would say are really getting this right at the moment?
Well, we've got 100 members, so if I say a handful, everyone else will be offended. But I'm going to do it anyway. It's worth the risk, right?
Fine.
There are some that are really good and are doing lots of very interesting things. Again, sometimes in partnership with national government. So Oxford and Oxfordshire are working with Innovate UK, the Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme, where they've got two really innovative programmes. One, which is using demand response and what one of the local councillors politely calls a bloody big battery, connecting that battery to manage some of the demand on the national grid, and also connecting it up to EV charging at the park and ride. That is something which is actually being able to enable the local community to benefit from that kind of demand management that we'll need. They've also got a very community-based scheme which is looking at how to improve people's ability to be able to manage their energy locally. And I'd make this point, which I'm sure Faye will be much better at doing as an engineer, but as somebody has pointed out to me, and it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me as a non-engineer, you can do all the nuclear power that you want, you can do all the offshore wind that you want, but that is big levers, which people in Whitehall really like. They like something big and shiny with a, high-vis jacket, hard hat, heard that before. But the stuff that will really make a difference to making sure that our grid system works efficiently and effectively is smart local energy systems, because baseload and offshore wind on their own will not meet the gap. So if there was one thing that I would love to get into the heads of the Treasury and BEIS in particular, is you will not have an efficient and effective decarbonised energy system unless you decentralise. And that will require the kind of innovation that we've seen in Oxford and Oxfordshire, Nottingham, Bristol, and many others, and Leeds in particular, where they're thinking about this in a whole systems way. And I know people get very enthusiastic about, oh, what can I do? But you guys know and understand systems, and this is a systemic change. And that's why local authorities are so important, because they have powers and levers across all the sectors that are required, particularly those two that need decarbonising fastest, which is heat and transport.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Polly, and great to hear Oxfordshire. I have to say I'm from Oxfordshire, so that's pleasing to hear. But as a good CBI member, I won't say which region is my favourite around the UK. That equally gets me in a pile of trouble. But I'm sure many in the audience can bring out some other examples. Faye, it would be great to go to you, obviously with an engineering background, head of energy and performance services at Siemens. And your role is really helping businesses improve their energy efficiency and all of that. And I wonder if you could just give some insights into how businesses are helping to make this happen, and also where you see some of the gaps at the moment, and how businesses can help to fill some of those gaps.
Yeah, and well, I think following on from what Polly was explaining around the move from centralised to decentralised, that has been happening for some time. And I quite liked one of the maps that was shared from the Carbon Brief, where they showed when the Climate Change Act came out in 2008, that where our power was coming from was 56 centralised power stations, about 4/5 around fossil fuels, and a handful of renewable projects. And then going 10 years forward, we've got 3,000 renewable generation projects, we've got 800,000 distributed assets, and that happened within a time span of 10 years. And so that shift's happening, and I think it's completely right that a lot of the big things are being done, a lot of the big areas, there's the right sort of market dynamics being created, but we're getting to the hard stuff, and especially when we're getting closer and closer to the end users, whether they're large industrial end users or sort of community-based projects. They're very diverse, they're very local, and they're very complex. And some of the work that we did was seeing, the critical role there around local leadership. And I think you have got a lot of areas and examples where people are stepping up to show that leadership, but it's in a very difficult framework for all the practical reasons that you were explaining. And we also see some of these gaps there around both the sort of the carrot and the stick, seeing like, have we got the right sort of policy there? Have we got the right level of regulation? Because we can give the examples of where there's good things happening, but if we're doing it case by case by case, how can we react as a business to see what's the roadmap to actually get to that scalability? And that's been something we've been really keen to do, is we've got examples of what we've done in Manchester, or Stoke City Council has been a good example, where they've just been doing the obvious things around energy efficiency, lighting upgrades, air source heat pumps, taking advantage of the public sector decarbonisation scheme that came out. They're just making sure that, as with about 300 local authorities stated a climate emergency over the last 3 years, they're one of them who are going, and we're acting on it, we're doing it, we can't wait to see what's going to come. But we need to see some things change so that we get that level of scalability. And I think another benefit that we have is looking at now what happened in sectors like offshore wind. And that's a sector that's absolutely flourished. But if we know that that's happened over a time span, and it was only in 2019 when the offshore wind sector deal was released, saying what if that type of sector deal was released 20 years prior? Would we be in a point where only one of the OEMs have invested in a city like Hull, creating over 1,000 jobs and having that type of capacity there? So I think that's where we can look back and see, right, what can we do better now looking forwards?
Yeah, that's great, Faye. And it's, can you think of one or two policies that would really sort of make a difference, I think, to some of that impact or scalability that you're seeing in some of those communities?
I think there are some good examples, like the PSDS, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme.
Yeah.
That was purposefully there to act as an economic stimulus and get the activity, and it did that.
Yeah.
And it's taken some good steps. But there's some existing ones where we can see improvements to go. There's a little bit of clunkiness around that, and how do we really have a long-term investment when it's a very short burst of activity? So there's some there that can be improvements. There's also, I think it was mentioned over the last day and a half, around some policies will come and go, which gives us a bit of uncertainty even if they're in place. So does it have that sort of long-term vision there that we can actually take some confidence in and just take away some of this the ambiguous nature that we're working in?
Yeah, definitely, Faye. And I think, as you'll know, the CBI, there's that long-term policy certainty, and when we've got policies that are working too often, we sort of stop, or we don't. It was what Tony was talking about yesterday morning about the eco schemes to improve home insulation, and we're still waiting for Eco4 to come out, and I think we need to see the continuation of some of these policies that are working. So some great examples there. David, I thought I might sort of bring you in. You're obviously Global Head of Sustainability and the Environment and Human Rights at RB. You can talk from a global perspective, but also actually I think you've got some great examples about what's happening on the ground in Hull and how that's really turning into a world-leading cluster around the environment.
Thanks, Ren. Well, I'd hope it will do. I think Polly hit the nail on the head before. We're hearing all the right noises from national government, but people are starting to drive things forward at a local level. Businesses are starting to drive things forward locally and internationally. The time for just having a target is clearly long gone. You need to follow that up with roadmaps and activities that then drive it forward. And that's exactly what we, and indeed a whole host of other businesses, public sector actors, across Hull and Humberside have been doing in the Oh Yes Net Zero campaign up there. Now the drive there is to help Hull and the Humber region to be net zero by 2050, and that's important from a Reckitt point of view because it's one of our biggest global manufacturing sites. It's the home of Dettol. We've been there for nigh on 200 years, and it's a major part of our overall roadmap to net zero for ourselves as a business. But at a wider level, the Humber region is, I think, the largest emitting region with about 37% of the country's carbon. So getting the Humber moving is really important. Now, it's fortunate in many ways because it has some of that offshore opportunities, and we're seeing the growth of different sectors like hydrogen around there, which is definitely helping to drive it. But without the infrastructure, the connections, the collaboration, that won't really gather pace particularly quickly. And that's why the work that's going on, driven by the council, the university, various different businesses, but also people like the NHS, in collaboration, is starting to build that infrastructure and that network of collaborative learning, but progress. And what we're seeing is activity coming through from various different actors. The university hospital up there, reducing its carbon emissions using solar, but also thinking about how it replaces anesthetic gases, which themselves are a major emission. So we forget sometimes about what we do when we think just about energy supply. It's much bigger than that. Trust me, I have a major Scope 3 problem. But it's also, the council itself. The council's investing over 100 million in capital projects, but also in projects that are helping to improve home insulation. There are housing trusts that are starting to develop the opportunities for heat source pumps that help provide more efficient and decarbonised domestic supplies. And this is connecting also to that cost of living conversation we were hearing about before. It also links into training, and one of the comments we picked up in the earlier session this morning, and I think that's hugely important when we talk to the levelling up conversation, because with those changes in approach, with those changes in supply opportunities, then you also get the opportunities for growth. And that's where one of the programmes that we're involved with the council with is to invest in different education approaches for teenagers to bring different skills through. But there's also the Ron Deering University Technical College that is dialing up apprenticeships and specific learning activities and opportunities to build the skill base, knowing that in the area, those jobs then come available because you create that supply and demand that business is very good at. And I think it's reassuring that the network is really drawing together. So as well as the people who are doing it, you've also got people offering advice, the university, EY, NatWest Bank, for example. And you see this network coming together to start helping people to deliver the action plans they've defined against the targets that they've set. That's the sort of collaboration that I think, if we can scale that approach up, then we have lots more opportunities to deliver exactly what Polly was saying.
Yeah, and David, if you had a magic wand and could to help change one thing that would really kind of help to scale that faster, what would it be?
Gosh, we wouldn't be sat here if I had that magic wand, Rain, would we, to be fair? I think it's about simplifying the flow of finance sometimes.
Yeah.
It does take a long time for some of the financial levers to be pulled and to be activated.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing, particularly in the Northeast, is there is an appetite that people want to do things quickly over the next 2 or 3 years, but it's taking too long sometimes for that funding to come available. The private sector is helping that, but I think that's where that connection between local and national government policy position that Polly was talking to is really important to speed that up.
Yeah,
I think we need to be honest about the fact that policy makes things more expensive. So we need to, although I know the CBI is always keen on certainty, but there might actually need to be some rules changes in order for the finance to flow. And when we've got our all-party parliamentary group on sustainable finance, quite often the conversation starts on, well, there's lots of money, why is it not flowing? And we find the reason why it's not flowing is because the rules make things more expensive. And they particularly do when you're trying to do local things at scale.
Yeah, and I think...
And just to build on that, because I think at COP last year, we heard about the trillions that are available for the activity. And I was in a lot of conversations with investors, with banks. They were struggling to actually find homes for that money because those rules slow things down.
Yeah.
We've got to open that up fast.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, some of you may have seen the panel yesterday. You know, the challenge is you still need those streams of returns for the finance to be able to reach, right? It still has to be providing a return, and that's about, you know, the right policy frameworks and more speed in decision making, absolutely. Guy, really keen to bring you in, obviously Director of Strategy at Energy Systems Catapult, that systems change that Polly was talking about. You're really at the sort of forefront of helping businesses deliver some of that change within the energy system. I just wonder if you could sort of bring your perspective on some of the issues we've touched on so far.
I think it's pretty simple in some ways. If we don't empower local areas to be a driving force in decarbonisation, it just won't happen.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that. You know, if all we had to do was decarbonise the electricity system, we could probably get away with, you know, local authorities not being involved or local areas not being involved. You know, we've got some systems there. But when you start getting into the tough stuff, buildings, transport, etc., if you don't have that buy-in, that consent from the local areas, then people just rebel, and they'll just say no, and elected officials, elected politicians will just refuse it. So it starts with heat, because heat and buildings are local. So you've got to understand the building stock. You know, if you're decarbonising Cornwall, it's very different from if you're decarbonising Glasgow. But then quite quickly it gets into transport, because transport used to be this nice separate system that kind of had its own planning regime and we didn't really think about. But as transport becomes electrified, you need to think about how it integrates. And of course, once you start thinking about heat and transport, then you've got to think about what's the state of the grid, et cetera, et cetera. And so the whole energy system, including you know, the pipes and the wires, the sources of generation, and the buildings, and crucially, consumers, people, voters, citizens, whatever you want to call them. If you don't get them all bought into it, and that's got to happen at a local level. And that's what we at the Catapult spend a lot of time, you know, over the last few years thinking about how that would work in practice. So how do you come up with a credible plan for a local area? Because as Polly says, there is huge enthusiasm going on at local areas, but the kind of activity is a bit chaotic at the moment. People get a consultant's report and they think, oh great, that's going to answer the question. There's lots of kind of, dare I say, favoured white elephant projects. Somebody at the golf club has got a hydro scheme that gets recommended, etc. This is not, if we kind of proceed in this kind of slightly haphazard way, what you will end up with is net zero being a lot more expensive than needs to be, pushback locally, and citizens not involved. But the opportunity is absolutely huge in terms for businesses. Heat networks, general network investment, energy efficiency improvements, better services, better options to people to help them decarbonise. And lots of the innovators we work with at the Catapult are kind of desperate to get that happening locally.
I'm keen to come out to the audience, so maybe as people are formulating their questions, and maybe Guy, I could just ask you briefly, what is one sort of plan that's happening at the moment that you're really excited about that isn't a white elephant?
Well, the place, it's always, you know, we can talk about the areas that are leading the way, and Manchester and West Midlands, where we're based, Nottingham, a few other cities are really going for it, and they've got credible, robust plans. They've identified the projects that are the priorities. Actually, what I think is more interesting and is a greater opportunity is those next wave of local government, where they might have declared a climate emergency with an extraordinary level of ambition and literally have no idea what they're going to do on Monday to kind of solve it. So it's part of the reason we've developed a platform called Net Zero Go, which is a kind of one-stop shop for those areas to be able to go and start building plans and project finance, and to bring the supply chain in so that they can then support local authorities. And that's a big part of the kind of role of Catapult, is joining up the supply chain with the opportunities. Yeah,
I like that. Net Zero Go, that's a good, but keen to come out to the audience for some questions for our panel. So I can see some hands are starting to go up. We're a bit blinded by the light here, so but I can see number one is here. So we'll bring that in, and I think I saw another hand. Just, exactly. So number two, we'll go to next, the lady back. And I'll probably do two questions and then come to our panel.
Thank you. Martin Hawley from Winsland. I just wanted to emphasise the grassroots level. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for councils, business, colleges, further education, universities to support the sort of growing evolution of carbon co-ops. There's people-powered retrofit. I'm just thinking of some examples that I know from Manchester, the Manchester area. And I think, there's just opportunities there for businesses to put some resources in and help these organisations evolve and thrive.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. And I think we had a lady just at mic number two.
Thank you. Grace Smith, Sembcorp Energy. Given that some areas are moving faster than others, is there a risk that we end up with a Great Britain that's made up of jigsaws of various solutions that don't actually mesh that well at a national level, and we find ourselves, as we get closer to 2050, trying to stitch pieces into one picture, and it all ends up a bit messy?
Yeah, that's a sort of great question, and it also sort of builds on this idea as well that, like, what if you have areas kind of competing with each other, right, to be the absolute best in one particular technology? How can we make sure that it's complementary rather than just different areas trying to outcompete each other? And it's sort of a couple of great questions there.
I'll come in on
and then I'll bring some of you in.
I'll come in on the point. I think it was Grace. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Said about that. First of all, I'm quite happy with different areas competing against each other. I think it's quite healthy. I think that's how you'll get lots of innovations. But you're absolutely right. It's got to work as a national system. There's a kind of perception sometimes when we talk about local energy systems that we're going to have all these areas that are kind of islanded, and Newcastle's going to have its own system. We're going to go back 100 years before we introduced the grid. It's obviously got to work as a system, but that means you need plans that are consistently done in a kind of robust way based on the same data in different areas. So you can kind of zoom in and out. Again, it's another part of the kind of systems approach is thinking about that. But again, that's got to be designed by policy. So government has got to work out what's the right role for local authorities, how does it zoom up? And so when you're making big regional, national decisions, future of the gas grid, how much you're going to reinforce transmission systems, etc. They are made based on information, but are kind of zoomed in and out on it. And just on the point that Martin made, it's a slight tangent, but the role of the public sector kind of estate in decarbonisation is a great opportunity to kind of go first and move forward. We've done one of the projects we've done at the Catapult is something called Modern Energy Partners, where we work with hospitals and with MOD sites, Ministry of Defence sites, and prisons about how they decarbonise. Turns out it's not that easy to change a light bulb in a prison, for example, right? You've got to think through the practical, but it's all part of that general point that others have made, is we've got to move from the targets to the actual what's the plan, what's the implementation actions needed.
Can I use this opportunity in responding to Grace to be nice about Ofgem? I've probably spent about the last 5 years being horrible about them, but it was justified, and now they've changed their minds, which is great. I think one of the things that they used to say to us is, well, you know, if everybody got EVs tomorrow, the grid would fall over. And I would say, yes, but that's not going to happen. So why are you proposing that as a problem to what we've got to do, which is decarbonise and decentralise? They now understand that decentralisation of electricity is required in order to be able to achieve decarbonisation. They also have the social equity requirement in their statute, and that's what they are rightly concerned about. So when I have conversations with them, they'll say, look, Western Power Distribution have got, Bristol have committed to being net zero by 2030, and we've got a connector problem to Cornwall, who've got excess clean energy that they're generating, and we can't actually get it out. So how do you expect us to be able to establish some kind of set of rules that meets the political target of Bristol and the practical opportunity that offers Cornwall? And my response is, well, that is definitely your job, so pick it up, right? Because you are the regulator of the energy system, and if you don't have the right tools in place, you need to ask some questions about why your tools are wrong. And that is why I would big them up, because they have genuinely taken that on board and started to ask for evidence about what needs to change in those regulatory frameworks in order for us to be able to have the kind of systems that we're talking about and connecting them up, like Guy says. Because we don't want to go back 100 years to a place where things are islands and they're not connected up. But we do need to acknowledge that places are different, particularly when it comes to heat, I'd point out. We've been used to, almost all of my life, relying entirely on natural gas on pretty much the vast majority of the population. And the idea that you don't have something which is the same everywhere kind of freaks people out. And I understand why, but we will need to understand that there will be different sources of heat depending on where you are. We still need to have equity in terms of cost. We need to still have reliability, even if the sources of that heat are going to be different in terms of technologies. So yes, of course, get those technologies right, but understand that the regulatory framework which enables them to be reliable and affordable is the key thing as far as the consumer is concerned. Otherwise, they'll be frightened. And the last thing you want is frightened consumers, or dare I say it, frightened voters.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great points there. I can see we've got a question at number 3, and I think I can see somebody with their hand up over there. So I'll bring in those 2 questions, and particularly looking to Faye and David to bring you in. Have we got a question at number 3? Yes, we have. There you go. Sorry. Thank you.
Sarah Carlington. I'm from Wakefield City Council. So 2 kind of related questions. A big theme from yesterday was planning and the barrier that planning has. I mean, I think as local authorities, that's also something that we would feel. So I'd be interested to have your perspective on the extent to which that positive relationship we've got in Hull cluster supports positive conversations more widely on planning, and then linked to that, how important is a mayor for some of this stuff compared to other kinds of leadership, including business leadership, from your experience?
Yeah, excellent. Great question there. I'll bring in number 1, the lady over there.
Hello, Olga Muscat, Bain & Company. You probably were talking about the need to strengthen the grid and upgrade infrastructure. We are actually not just strengthening infrastructure for net zero. We are also coming to a tipping point in our wastewater infrastructure, being 100 years old on average, and we are trying to roll out telco, much stronger, faster internet to the whole country. For all of those infrastructure investments, a big part of the cost is the civils, not the equipment itself, is the digging up the roads. What is needed from local authorities to help reduce the cost of that by better coordination between different providers of infrastructure?
Excellent. I think, David, could we go to you first just to get that perspective for Wakefield and what can you learn from the experience in Hull and what might happen in terms of planning in particular?
No, thanks, Sarah. A great question. I mean, I think from our perspective, the opportunity of running those conversations in collaboration with the council, but a whole host of other local key stakeholders, will help on some of that planning conversation. Because what you've got is a very clear shared objective, and that then helps drive consistent decisions towards that. It plays to some of the points that Guy was talking about earlier. It's almost like a freedom within a framework conversation where you can sketch that framework out in national policy, but then you, at a local level, you dial up the stuff that really matters locally, and then you can, work within that broad framework, but do what matters most locally. And the coordination then really drives that discussion and progress at pace, I think. I'm somewhat agnostic on the perspective of a mayor versus other setups. I think that I'll leave that for other people to comment on. But what's clear, whichever the leadership model is that there has to be collective ownership and therefore leadership through the action plan to decarbonise. How it's then run specifically, I'm less bothered about. But if there is that collective ownership and leadership to tackle the issue, then I think you get the coordination that's necessary beyond that.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Faye, I wonder if we might bring you in on some of those questions just from what you see, and both in terms of the change in the energy, but also, there's some other, waste and water are all really important. What are you seeing from the businesses that you work with?
Yeah, I think the last question was an interesting example of the specific there on civils, and we're seeing this a lot across our different projects, where actually we also need to think about sort of skills and workforce that's available, not just in terms of being cost competitive, but being able to do it on time and get some certainty. The current climate is making this very difficult, so we've got a short-term problem, but there's also opportunities that sit within there, because when you think about I think Guy was mentioning it earlier around how things are changing so much around electricity and around heat and transport and water, that it's very difficult then to say, what is that optimum solution at a local level? It almost goes beyond, I am an engineer, but it goes beyond what I could consider anyway. And that's where I think there's an opportunity for us around digital skills in the UK, where we've done a lot of work with local authorities with creating digital twins of a city, running a number of simulations and seeing, let's be informed about what the best options are. Let's try and avoid unintended consequences for the medium term and long term, and actually build that up as a centre of competence in the UK, where we can do this sort of digital analysis. And then once we install the infrastructure, also the analytics and the service as well. So there's an opportunity there, but there is a challenge just in practically how we start to deliver these projects, which comes back to one of the earlier questions around how important collaboration is. So we worked with some local authorities and have sort of even talked to them about their procurement activities and said, look, we're a company that we've got over 65,000 suppliers. We've got quite a large buying power. How could we help benefit from that to sort of transfer some of the risks that you're taking and some of the resource you're trying to build to try and work with some of the private sector? Again, because we're working with some parts of limited resource availability, so we can't all go out and try and build up the same skills and go to the same sort of suppliers. So there's an absolutely essential role there on collaboration, private sector, public sector, universities to pull in the role of innovation and the future sort of workforce. So.
Yeah, Faye, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of these newer technologies, I mean, air source heat pumps have been around for a while, but actually, they're connected devices. So if you're installing, it's different to installing a gas boiler, which generally are traditional and don't, but the newer ones are connected. So you need those basic digital skills, right,
Yeah.
to be able to understand some of the diagnostics that come out from when you're wrong. And I think even looking back to the work we did on regional growth, almost 5 or 7 years ago, skills was the one lever that could make the biggest impact almost pretty much across regions in the UK. Polly, I know there was a question for you there. I might come to you.
Yeah,
and then
I'm happy to pick that up. I think one of the things that was quite striking about one of the things I learnt from the Innovate UK projects in Oxford is that once they got planning permission, they dug a 7-kilometre long pipeline, and that they didn't need to ask for any more permission. They just had so partly there isn't a requirement to coordinate, and that is the problem. Right? If there was more powers for local authorities to go, whoa, hang on a minute, if you're digging that hole, let's put some other things down while you're at it, it might significantly improve and reduce costs. I'd just like to pick up on, I'm not necessarily talking about strengthening the grid. That's the position that the DNOs, the distribution network operators, tend to emphasise, that there needs to be more strengthening of the grid. But I think if we are smart about our energy system, we can actually manage flexibility and demand response, so we're not always waiting for there to have to be more strengthening of the grid, because we can use what we've got better and more smartly. I'd go back again to the issue of rules, for example. We need to change the rules around not being able to provide ahead of need. You have to get a special derogation from Ofgem to be able to provide heat network pipes, for example, ahead of the amount of housing you're building. The Olympic Village managed to get a special derogation from Ofgem, say, look, we only need 300 for the Olympic Village, but we want to have 3,000 later on. And they had to get a special dispensation in order to be able to build a heat network big enough for the amount of homes they needed later. That should not have to be an exception. That should be how you do things by default. And we need to simplify those rules if we want to be able to get there. I'm really concerned, and going to the Sarah from Wakefield, that the planning bill that we're going to get, the sort of regeneration and levelling up, is going to produce a ceiling, not a floor, on standards that local authorities can introduce in order to be able to achieve net zero. And that will be really problematic, because actually what you need is to have a standard which you can then exceed. That allows you to unleash the innovation, create markets and so forth, and particularly going to Guy's point, use your procurement powers as a local authority to start doing things on the public sector estate which enable the able to pay to feel confident that there's going to be the workforce and the skills able to do things in the future. So I would say anybody here who's got any eye on that legislation, that is a particular one to look out for, because I'm very concerned that a ceiling, a limit on our innovation will be a bad thing for designing the net zero that we need in our localities.
Yeah, absolutely. Guy, I wonder if we might come to you for a sort of last word, just to bring some of those themes together.
Well, as someone who spent most of his life kind of arguing for getting market frameworks right and the power of markets to deliver this, I think, linking up Sarah's point with what Olga said is we actually, in these monopoly infrastructure areas, we need kind of more coordinated planning. We need to think about more whole systems planning, because you've got some areas we do, really strong, well-developed planning system, transport, etc. Areas we'll spend a lot of time thinking about that. Lots of people in this room will provide services that will support that. But we just don't do that with energy. And then we definitely don't coordinate it with all the other issues that Olga was talking about. And that absence of a plan, because once you've got that in place and you've got permissions, then you can go faster. So I really think it is absolutely essential that that's brought in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Guy, and a huge thank you to all of our panelists. I'm sure we could carry on the conversation. I think what we've learned is that this stuff is really hard, right? This is a sort of theme. Getting this right isn't easy, but almost that diversity of approach actually at different areas can be a real strength, but you need to have that right level of coordination and the right policies to really enable this to happen. So a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you to your questions, and I'm sure we can carry on the conversations over lunch and beyond. And I think I will hand over to Matthew, who will just tell us what happens next.
Brilliant. Well, look, Rain, Polly, Faye, Guy, David, huge thanks for that panel. Really, really good. Just... just hold that thought around lunch for another session if you would. We're going to take a couple of minutes now just to do a quick set and microphone changeover, and we've got one more session on carbon markets before we break for lunch. So a couple of minutes and we're right back here for the session on carbon markets. Thank you.